Welcome everyone. I am Ken Clairbout, K4ZW, on the east coast of the United States in the Washington, D.C. area, and have with me, at least evening here, Dean Straw, N6BV, who is out on the western portion of the U.S. in San Francisco, so we're happy to have Dean with us here. Most of you know the routine. We will take questions for the presentation, but we do hold them until the end, so you can send in your questions at any point, but I'll hold them until the end of the presentation. And the other thing I want to mention is we will try at the end of the presentation to take some questions directly from people. If you have a microphone connected and you'd like to speak to us, I'll give you instructions for doing that. We'll try that at the end of the presentation as well. So listen, we got a great program. Dean's got plenty of information to share with us, so I'm just going to go ahead and hand it off to him, and he can go ahead and get started. Dean, the floor is yours, and you may have to click in your PowerPoint window to get things rolling. But go ahead. Welcome, okay. And welcome back.
Well, thank you, Ken, and I want to thank you for all the efforts you've done in terms of these webinars. You have been the stalwart on it for, what, 3 or 4 years now, and have produced a tremendous amount of great material for the amateur radio service. I want to also thank the Worldwide Radio Operators Foundation. That has got to be the world's most impossible acronym to pronounce, WWROF. But the Worldwide Radio Operators Foundation has sponsored this webinar as well as other ones, and will be doing so in the future. What I'm going to be talking about tonight here in San Francisco time, and I realize it's different times around the world. I know there's one station in 3 Victor 8 that's on, and there's an LU1 on as well, and some Europeans on. But what we're going to talk about tonight is practical notes on terrain assessment. I've been doing terrain assessment for just about 2 decades of time, so I've subtitled this presentation, What I've Learned in 2 Decades of Terrain Assessment. Here's what I'm particularly fond of. About a couple of years ago, I was out at the N6RO station, and I was doing maintenance inside the shack, and all of a sudden I heard this very loud noise, and I looked outside. The sky was almost black with these birds, and so I grabbed the camera and I took a picture of the 10 meters, the top Yagi at 10 meters of about 100 foot high, and I counted later on. I counted about 200 birds on this one Yagi alone, and there were many more on the 20 meters and 40 meters and 15 meter stacks. I figured there must have been 3,000 or 4,000 birds. Okay, so that's a little bit of light activity. Since I'm going to be talking about terrain, I felt it appropriate to quote from the ARRL antenna book in the 22nd edition, and I'll read it here. The subject of how to choose a QTH for working DX has fascinated hams since the beginning of amateur operations. No doubt Marconi spent a lot of time wandering around Newfoundland looking for a great radio QTH before making the first transatlantic transmission. And there's a little picture of Guglielmo Marconi when he was a young man. So since there have been hams, and Marconi counted himself as one of the very first hams, since there have been hams around, they've been looking for good QTHs to work DX. Now, I have said this a number of different times in a number of different presentations, but in order to scientifically plan a station, an HF station, you need, first of all, the range of elevation angles. You need to know how your antenna performs, and you do that usually nowadays with computer modeling of antennas in free space or over perfect ground. And then you need to know the effects of what the local terrain is doing to your launching of HF signals into the ionosphere. Now, about 20, in fact, more than 20 years ago, I started a detailed study at ARRL headquarters that tried to figure out the range of elevation angles needed for communications between various locations around the world. And I used the ION-CAP program, which has been since the 1990s upgraded to be VOA-CAP, run by the Voice of America people, along with some proprietary software I wrote. At one time, at the AWRO headquarters in the lab, there was a 8286 computer. Remember those old computers? An 8086 running for 2 weeks, 24 hours a day for 2 weeks to compute 10 transmitting QTHs to the rest of the world. Nowadays, I've upgraded the statistics a couple of years ago using a Pentium 4 machine and running at 1.6 gigahertz, and that took only 2 days to do 270 plus transmitting QTHs around the world. So the statistics, the amount of data that's crunched to produce the elevation statistics is quite horrendous, quite a large amount of storage space necessary. This is a printout showing the statistical range of elevation angles needed by band. I've highlighted in red the 20-meter band just because I'll be using this in later parts of the presentation. What this is saying is that this 9.3 is the percentage of elevation angles from Boston, Massachusetts to all of Europe. It says that 9.3% of all the times when the 20-meter band is open between Boston and Europe, that means all days, all hours, all months, all levels of solar activity. 4 degrees is the takeoff angle 9.3% of all those times. There's a secondary peak here, secondary peak, let me get that back here, at 7.4% of the time it occurs at 11 degrees. So, let's see. Okay, here we go. Let's talk about antenna performance parameters, that is to say modeling. In the last 30 or so years, computer antenna modeling has come a whole long way. Most modern computer modeling programs, such as EasyNet, for example, are derived from NEC2 Fortran code. I'm sure some of you are old enough and remember Fortran, which stands for Formula Translation. It's quite one of the older computer languages. I studied it in college about almost 50 years ago. I studied Fortran, I think it was Fortran 2 at the time, and I still program in Fortran because it's a very, very capable mathematical program to very efficient procedures and internal guts necessary to do pretty hairy mathematical work. The Fortran that I use is Fortran for Windows now. Now, 2, the modeling program NEC2 that is the heart of programs such as EasyNet, over flat ground, and it also works in free space. What it doesn't do, however, is work that well when diffraction is involved. It takes into account reflections off flat ground very well, but it does not do a very good job, and it never was designed to actually operate with their diffractions. Now, the effects, over the last dozen or so years, actually longer than that, I've evaluated literally hundreds of digital QTHs all around the world. I'm still in contact with many people who ask me to give them help on evaluating. My wife just came in here with a little sign saying, slow down a little bit. Well, I'm trying to cover a whole bunch of territory. She says I should breathe in between. So that's my lovely wife, Rama, is helping out here. So I'll try to talk a little bit more slowly, but I've evaluated many digital QTHs all around the world. And in other webinars conducted by Ken, K4ZW, I've dealt in rather excruciating detail on how to get digital terrain data to use within HFTA. Since I've done that in the past, I won't dwell here on getting terrain data, but I refer you to the VRC and the N6BV websites to get the webinars that I've done previously on how to get digital terrain data. Now, instead, what I'm going to talk about during this presentation is how you can interpret HFTA results so that you can optimize your HF antenna system. Back about, well, more than 20 years ago, back in 1991, Bill Myers, K1GQ, was one of the most bright people I know in the world, incredibly intelligent man, shared with me some computer code that ray traced reflections across real-world terrain. And what Bill did was challenge me or inspire me to add the ability to take diffractions into account. And thus was born the DOS program, YT, which stands for Yagi Terrain Analysis, and eventually the Windows program, HFTA. HFTA comes bundled with on the disk with the ARRL antenna book, been available in the antenna book since the 19th edition. The 19th, the 20th, 21st, second editions of the ARRL antenna book. Now, HFTA stands for High Frequency Terrain Assessment. It is a ray tracing program, and the best way for me to picture what HFTA is doing, or what a ray tracing program is doing, is to consider the program as though it were a rifle, a gun. And you shoot bullets in steps of 1/4 degree from plus 45 to minus 45 degrees. Then you watch and see how the bullets interact with the terrain, either through reflection or diffractions. Now, HFTA integrates the computed elevation response of an antenna array together with the elevation angles that are statistically necessary to launch HF signals into the ionosphere. And as usual, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is the output graph from HFTA at 14.2 megahertz. The blue line here is the elevation response of a 70-foot high 3-element Yagi. And this is again at 20 meters at 14.2 megahertz. So the blue line, the blue curve, is the elevation response of a Yagi. It says that at just about 14 degrees, the peak gain is 12.8 dBi. Now, remember the table of the printout of the elevation angles for 20 meters? This is a bar graph overlaid with the XY graph, showing the percentage of the elevation angle statistics in terms of a percentage. For example, take this peak right over here. It says that at 11 degrees takeoff angle, for all the times when the 20-meter band is open, it is open 7.4% of the time at this angle of 11 degrees. The peak angle over here at 4 degrees is just over 9% of all the times when the 20-meter band is open. So what it does is it shows you what angles you need statistically, and then it shows you what gain you get over a particular terrain. Now, in the case of this simple example, it's the terrain is flat. I'd use that for illustration. Now, you may be curious, what would a perfect response be? Well, the elevation angles go from 1 degree up to about 32 degrees, 31 degrees here. And so a perfect response would be a flat top response of an antenna over all of those angles from 1 to 31 degrees. Obviously, real-world antennas don't act that way, but that would be how we get a perfect response to cover all the necessary angles. Now, I'll show a series of pictures here to show you what's going on in terms of terrain profile. This is the terrain profile for Randy K5 Zulu Delta, who lives in western Massachusetts, about 40 or 50 miles outside of the city of Boston, Massachusetts. And he has a terrain that drops off 100 feet in 1,000 feet away from the base of his tower. Now, in terms of how this terrain interacts with with signals, the slope that's nearest the tower base is the most important. This is what his response is for reference purposes for a flat antenna over flat ground 50 feet high and a 5-element Yagi. It's got a very smooth shape that peaks around here at 18 degrees for flat ground. Now then you take his actual terrain, this is toward the direction of Europe, 45 degrees heading. You can see that the energy over here has been kind of squooshed over so that it peaks up now. Instead of peaking up at an angle of 18 degrees, it's peaking up at an angle of about 8 degrees. So the steep terrain of Randy's antenna, his 20-meter antenna, even at 50 feet high, has really emphasized the lower angles and the medium angles over here, and has had a major effect compared to the flatland antenna, to the antenna over flat ground. Now, notice this figure of merit here. It says it's 15.4 compared to a figure of merit of 12.2. Let's look into that figure of merit, which is also abbreviated FOM. It's kind of complicated, so I'll read exactly what it is. The figure of merit, FOM, shown in HFTA is the gain at each elevation angle multiplied by the elevation angle's percentage for that angle for a particular path. These are summed and averaged over all angles from 1 to 35 degrees. So what FOM is, what a figure of merit is a statistical weighted gain, and it's calibrated in decibels reference to an isotropic antenna in free space. FOM, a figure of merit, is a snapshot of performance. Now, like any snapshot, FOM must be used carefully lest you gain the wrong impression. Remember the story of the 3 blind men and the elephants, where there was a blind man stationed in the center of the elephant, there was a blind man stationed towards the tail, and there was a blind man stationed at the head of the elephant, and he feels and finds a pointed instrument of some sort coming out of the nose of the elephant, so he thinks that it must have an arrow, a spear-like projection. That's the tusk, and he feels a long slithery thing and doesn't realize that it's a trunk, but he says that this animal must have a tongue like a snake, and it must have ears like a fan, and the guy in the middle, the blind man in the middle, feels the side of the body of the elephant, and he says it's like a brick wall, and the legs are like tree trunks. So, and the guy in the back end of the elephant is saying, "What do you two guys look at? I only find a rope at the end here." So each one of the blind men has got a particular impression of the elephant, but doesn't get the idea on what the entire picture is. Such is the same sort of thing as a figure of merit. It's a snapshot of an elephant, so to speak, and doesn't give you the complete picture until you look at the actual graph. Now, figures of merit change depending on the terrain in the direction of the target receiving area and on the frequency. So depending on where you point your antenna, the terrain will be different in each one of the directions, and it will be different for different target receiving areas on the other end of the circuit, and it will be different depending on the frequency as well. Now, here's an example. When I used to live on Cape Cod, my neighbor K5MA Portable 1 and I, N6BV Portable 1, had antennas were 270 feet apart. How do I know they were 270 feet apart? Well, we had a 270-foot dipole in between the two antennas, in between the two towers, so I knew we were 270 feet apart. Doesn't sound like a great difference, but you'll notice that the terrain in the red is my N6BV at Cape Cod was a little bit pointier, if you will, compared to Jan's K5M's direction, and this is into Japan. Into Europe, we had always had just about equal signals. They couldn't tell which one of us was stronger. It was dependent just upon instantaneous QSB on which one might be ahead in the pileup. So towards Europe, we had same signals, but into Japan, K5MA was usually one S unit louder than me into Japan. Here is the response for N6BV portable 1 pointed towards Japan. Here's the response for K5MA pointed into Japan. Now his tower was 80 feet tall and mine was 70 feet tall, but the difference was the terrain. In fact, because we lived so close together, we obviously couldn't operate contests simultaneously. So Jan would take the CW contest weekend and I would take the phone contest weekend usually, or we'd switch back and forth. But what we did is we had about a 400-foot long piece of RG-213 between our two houses. And when I would take the contest for a particular weekend, Jan would throw the switch in his shack and his antenna would become another choice of mine to operate. And every time, even though 400 feet of coax on 10 meters has about 5 or 6 dB of loss, his into Japan, including that loss in the 400 feet of coax, he was always, that antenna was always better than mine antenna towards Japan. So I became very fascinated at that point with the whole effects of terrain, because you wouldn't have thought that a 270-foot difference would have made that much of a difference in transmitted signal strength. Here's W6NL, Dave Leeson, towards the USA. He lives up on a beautiful ridge, on a beautiful mountaintop. This is the city of San Jose. And he puts out a very, very strong signal into the entire Northern California Bay Area, as well as into DX locations around the world. Here's his terrain. He's on the top of a 3,400-foot mountain, and one thing you'll note here is that the scaling in the terrain plot, the scaling for the x-axis distance from the tower base, and the y-axis, the height above average sea level, the x and the y-axes are set automatically in order to show the change of the terrain more vividly, so you can get an idea on where diffraction points occur. Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. Most likely this is one as well. But if you want to know what the true perspective of the slope is, here's a trick that I use. I use a flatland file that's 0 feet high, and I put a 14,400 foot antenna above that. See, 14,400, which is 4,400 meters distance, so that the x-axis over here, 14,400, and the y-axis over here, 14,400, are the same. This shows that the terrain is much more gentle looking in a true perspective than it is in the perspective over here, where I'm trying to emphasize the changes most vividly. Okay, that trick works. Now, so what things can I do inside HFTA? What can I change inside HFTA to affect the elevation angle response of an antenna? Well, the first thing I can do is I can change the antenna height. I can select the number of elements needed used on a Yagi. So there are choices of two, of a dipole, 2-element Yagi, 3-element, 4-element, 5-element, 6-element, 8-element Yagi, which goes out to about I think an 80-foot boom on 20 meters. You can stack 2 or more up to a maximum of 4 Yagis in a vertical stack. You can change the spacing between those stacked Yagis. You can move the tower back from a cliff or back from a hill to determine what the effect of that cliff or that hill is. And you can do bip bop, so-called bip bop, which is both in phase or both out of phase feed of the antennas. Let's examine each one of these cases one by one. The first is I can change the antenna height above ground. Here, for example, is W6NL on 28 megahertz on 10 meters. You'll notice this is a flatland antenna that's 35 feet high, and a 3-element Yagi. I always, or I attempt to always use on these elevation plots a flatland antenna so that I have a frame of reference about what is causing something to change. If you would put a 3-element Yagi at 35 feet high on W6NL's terrain, you'll notice that the gain varies very little for a wide range of elevation takeoff angles, so it is able to cover both low and high angles. And I'll get into what happens if you try higher heights on this kind of very steep terrain. For example, if you put, this is the 35 foot high over flat ground, and red is now a 60 foot high. And I've changed the Yagis, by the way, just for fun. Instead of 3 elements, I put 6 elements on here. 6 elements Yagi on 28 megahertz is about a 36 foot boom, maybe 40 foot boom, and it's only 35 feet off the ground, which is very interesting looking. It's much wider than it is tall, but that's a 6-element Yagi at 70 feet above W6NL's terrain. Notice has got a giant null right at 9 degrees, which is the highest percentage elevation angle statistically that you'll see. This is not where you want a hole in your response. So in this case, even though the gain is a little bit better down on the low angles, 1 or 2 degrees, than it is for a 35-foot antenna, the 70-foot antenna really suffers very greatly beyond about 6 degrees takeoff angle, and it's all due to the steep terrain at W6NL. Okay, well, the second thing you can do, you can select the gain, and you can change the number of elements for Yagi. In this case, this is at 14 megahertz W6NL's location. Each antenna is 35 feet high, 35, 35, 35. Oops. And what I'm changing is from a 2-element to a 3-element to a 6-element. And again, I'm using as my frame of reference a 35-foot high antenna with 3 elements. The blue is 2-element Yagi, the red is 3-element Yagi, and the green is a 6-element Yagi. And you can see that the shape of the terrains are the same, but what it changes is the absolute amount of gain due to the boom, the longer boomed Yagis when you go from 2 to 3 to 6 elements. Now, here I'm comparing, this is at 10 meters at 28.4 megahertz. I'm comparing a 3-element, the blue, and the red is 6 elements, and it's a little bit less cluttered. It's the same basic graph as the one just before, but what it's saying is that the response is set, the shape of this response is set by the terrain itself and the antenna height. That's what sets the terrain and makes it a different shape than a 3-element Yagi at 35 feet above flat ground. Okay, here's another thing you can do with HFTA. You can stack several Yagis. In this case, this is at 14.2 megahertz. It's a 3-element at 35 feet and 3-element at 70 feet. This is the 70-footer. This is the 35-footer. And this is when you put them in stack and feed them in phase. You can see that we've gone from a figure of merit of 9 dBi for the cyan, the light blue color, which is representing a flat terrain. It's got a figure of merit of 9 dBi. The stack is 12.5, or in other words, 3.5 dB on average stronger than any of the antennas shown on this by themselves. So what the 70 and 35-foot stack, the one in green, is doing, it is covering a range of angles, of elevation angles, with gain. And as I said, if you wanted a perfect response, it would go like from here to here. as a flat top, which is not possible, but this comes closer to realizing that kind of performance. This is another example at K1 Echo Alpha. Kenny Wolf is the guy who wrote CT, contest program, which has been around for about 20 years. It's now been superseded by Windows programs, but it was a programming. It was wonderful programming. It still is wonderful programming. Many in the early years of contesting software. Ken lives on a ridge in western Massachusetts. He's got a 120-foot high, 15-meter, 20-meter stack. The stacks are 4 over 4 over 4 over 4 on 15 meters and 4 over 4 over 4 on 20 meters. On 10 meters, he's got stack of 4 over 4 over 4 over 4 per stack, and as well as a full-size 3-element 40-meter monster antenna. One of a beautiful antenna. His terrain is as you can see, is mainly going downhill. One of the things you can do with terrain plot in HFTA is you can take the cursor and hold the button down and move it down and blow up any portion or zoom in on any portion of the curve. In this case, I've zoomed it in so that you can see that the terrain on 10 meters into Europe, for 100 foot, 80 foot, 60 foot, and 40 feet. By the way, for those who use meters, it's easy to change. The option button allows you to change from feet to meters. Anyway, it says that the terrain at K1EA is basically pretty flat out to 500 feet. I mean, it changes several feet over 500 feet. So this is pretty much close to what flat ground looks like, and then it goes as it goes further out from the tower. What does the response look like? Reference, in this case, is a flat land antenna with a stack of 100, 80, 60, and 40 feet for 4-element Yagis. That's a reference. And the actual response for Ken's stack over the terrain towards Europe is this dark blue one. And you can see that they're pretty close together. In fact, the figure of merit is 16.5 for the actual stack, and a figure of merit of 16.7, just a little bit better for the flatland situation. Because there's this little dip here at about 6 degrees, but all in all, I think I'd probably take the real-life version because it's got quite a bit of gain. About 6 dB more gain down here at 1 or 2 degrees takeoff angles, which are very useful for opening up the band. So the response is pretty close to flatland response. The maximum amount of gain, by the way, of this array, about 8 degrees takeoff angle, is 19.9 dB. Now 20 dBi is it's considered moon bounce gain territory. So Ken can work moon bounce with this array if it's pointed in the right direction, the moon's coming up in the right direction. Now, as I said, I use as a frame of reference always a flatland antenna with the same antennas used in a stack as the actual antenna. But here's another frame of reference. Let's say there's a little gun station with a tri-bander at 60 feet high and a flat response, a flat gain, a flat land. It's saying that at the peak of this little gun with a tri-bander at 60 feet, he's got a gain of 13 dBi versus almost 19 dBi on the stack. So you could say that this is a realistic or a practical form of reference for how the stack, 4-stack actually responds compared to a flatlander with a tri-bander. Okay, you can change the spacing between stack Yagis. In this case, what I've done here is shown the 120-foot antenna is in red over K6EA's terrain towards Europe. The full stack on 20 meters is 120 feet, 80 feet, and 40 feet, and that's the dark blue right here. The reference, of course, is my flatland with the same 120, 80, and 40 feet. And the figure of merit is 15.2 dpi for the flatland response, and 15.5. They're very close together. So the effect of Ken's terrain is that because it's flat out 500 or so feet before it starts to drop off the cliff, the response is closer to flatland than it would be if the antenna were located right at the edge of the cliff. Now, the green curve shows what happens when you use you take out the top Yagi out of the stack and you use 80 and 40 feet instead of 120, 80, and 40. And there are times beyond about around 16 degrees, which occur relatively rarely, maybe 5% of the time, when the lower stack of 2 would be better than the higher stack of 3 Yagis. So that's how you can change that's for the relatively normal spacings in the stacks. And what happens if you go too wide? Well, instead of taking out the top antenna, if you use the top and the lowest antenna at 120 and 40 feet, you can see that the figure of merit is down. That is going too wide for spacing, and you miss out on the lower angles. Excuse me, the higher elevation angles. So it's not an optimal array by any means if you take out the 80-foot antenna out of the stack. Okay, you can move the tower back from a cliff electronically rather than physically moving the whole thing. In this case, what I've done is I've changed the tower and moved it back 1,000 feet, and this is at the making it into flatland. That's at the same height as the start of where the tower is on the actual antenna, the blue one. Let me blow that up a little bit, zoom it out a little bit, and you can see that this is from 0 to 1,000 feet. Which is my moving the tower back 1,000 feet. What's to the actual response? Well, not a whole heck of a lot. The one that's moved back is red. The program assigns a -1 for the file name, and the actual antenna, the actual stack is in dark blue. You can see that the figures of merit are exactly the same, 15.5, 15.5, and over flat ground, the same stack at 120, 80, and 40 feet is 15.2. So again, K1EA's location, roughly 5 to 1,000 feet away from the cliff that drops off at that point, doesn't have that much effect because it's far enough away. Okay, bip-bop, both in phase or both out of phase. If you, at the entry point of the height of antenna, you put an asterisk, that means that the 120-foot, in this case, 120 asterisk antenna would be fed 180 degrees out of phase with the 80 and the 40-meter stack. So you can see that what it does is it moves the entire response over to the right, and so now the peak is at 21 or 22 degrees takeoff angle as opposed to 8 degrees. Now, rarely, people who do out-of-phase feed, they have a switch position available, but rarely does it actually prove useful because it makes the gain down at the lower angles that you need the gain. It makes it much less effective, but it's there still as a capability just in case. Now, you could make a case that if you have sporadic E and the sporadic E cloud is right above your head, you would need better response going up at the higher angles, and that has proved true. Although you don't get a lot of sporadic E on 20 meters, you can see this action happening on 15 and 10 meters when sporadic E is in. Okay, those are the more common terrains. some superstations. Here's some difficult terrains. Shooting uphill, saddlebacks, peaking over a hump. The terrain is too steep. What happens with distant mountains? What happens with different terrain shapes at different azimuths? And let's look at these one by one. First, a little sip of water. My good friend Rich Hollock, KY6R, King Yankee 6R, lives in a very challenging, he lives in a lovely neighborhood in, I think it's Orinda, California. It's a great neighborhood, great neighbors and everything like that, but he lives in a challenging location for to launch signals into the ionosphere. From California, from the San Francisco Bay Area region to Europe, it's about a 30-degree azimuth, heading of 30 degrees. You point your beam into Europe, into the Middle East. The azimuth, the heading that you point your beam at, is about 60 degrees, and you can see that. Whoops. There. You can see that the red line, the red curve, goes from his tower base about 600 feet. There's a hill of about 175 feet or so in roughly 1,000 feet. So he's got a challenging location. He sent me this this diagram showing KY6R deep in a valley. That's where his antenna is, and this is got a hill with some massive power lines on it. Cedar Lane is out here, and finally this mountain that he hasn't labeled is quite a challenge to shoot a signal over. This is, again, pointed into northeast and the southwest for the long path. I would say this is something called extreme DXing. And Rich finally made the honor roll this last month, and since he uses HFTA a great deal, he made up some hats. It's called Team HFTA, and presented me with this hat at the Visalia DX convention this last weekend. And honor roll for Rich with that terrain took patience, persistence, and his incredible, extreme enthusiasm. So it's extreme DXing, and it's with extreme enthusiasm that he does that. I really appreciate his attitude. Let's look at, we've looked at shooting uphill. Let's look at saddlebacks. This shape of terrain where the antenna is lower than this peak over here close in makes it look like the back end of a saddle. If your legs are pointed this direction, your rear end is seated at the saddle. That's what we call a saddleback. I'll zoom that in a little bit and show you that the antenna itself doesn't have a good view. You can't see over the saddleback at low angles, at low takeoff angles. Now, oops, this saddleback terrain was from NT1Y, who used to live in Vermont. He used to live in Vermont and had a very large contest station. Now, this is what his response is compared to a flatland antenna with 140, 690, and 40-foot high 20-meter Yagis, 6-element 20-meter Yagis. Again, the gain of that system at the optimum angle is very, very close to moon bounce level. But compared to a flatland, he's got a deficit of about 0.7 dB on average over the entire elevation angle of response of his antennas. And you might say, what a shame. Well, let's take a look at that proverbial tribander at 70 feet over flat ground, and you can see how he compares. At 4 degrees, the tribander is good for about 6 dBi of gain, about 14 dBi of gain, in other words, more than an S unit stronger. So Bill, it's hard to feel too bad for Bill. He doesn't have an absolutely maximum situation, but he's still incredibly, was very, very competitive in spite of the saddleback. But the saddleback is not rarely found. It's a fairly common sort of thing when you've got a ridge that you mount your antenna on, and maybe several hundred yards away there's a terrain that looks like a saddleback. That will affect your launch of your signal. It may not be fatal, but it doesn't help. Peaking over a hump, here we have KY6R Rich again. This is looking in the direction of New Zealand at 240 degrees heading, and he's got a little bit of a humpback looking situation here, where it looks a little bit like a saddleback, but in this case the antenna can almost peek over this little peak over here. And if you zoom out a little bit, you'll see that you can almost peek over this hump. That's why I call it peeking over a hump. What does it do to the actual elevation angle capability from this array? Not a whole heck of a lot. It's, in fact, because of the peaks, due to the let me go back here a second. Due to this downslope over here, the peaking gain that you get is actually a little bit higher than the flatland, but down at the very low angles, typically lower than about 6 degrees, his gain is affected. It's not quite as much as the flatland, but it's still better than his shot into Europe or the Middle East on the short path. On the long path, he can do very well into Europe. Now, the terrain is too steep, and I label that too. Is this too much of a good thing? Here's W6NL's location again, a 3,400-foot mountain. Now, if you put a 70-foot element, 70-foot in, that's the blue one right over here, 6-element Yagi, and compare it to a 35-foot high 6-element Yagi in green, you can see that the 70-foot high Yagi, and this is at 28.4 megahertz, the 70-foot Yagi suffers quite a bit in comparison to the 35-foot high. And so you might say, philosophically speaking, is the terrain too steep, or is the antenna too high for that steep terrain? And I maintain that it's the antenna, that the only thing you have control of is the height that you mount your tower on the terrain. Unless you really and truly are crazy and want to bulldoze the entire terrain down to make it flatter. Distant mountains. Here's a situation that occurred back, I think it was 1997, when the VK0IR, I believe that's when that de-expedition was going on. And this is the short path from W6 to from Heard Island, from VK0IR. It's got a little thing called a Big Bend volcano in the way, and guess where the path towards California goes? And what is the result? Well, the result is at below 11 degrees, there's essentially no gain at all. It's minus 6 dBi, and I make the parenthetical comment of good luck, California. There were very, very few stations actually worked in California from Heard Island on the direct path. So if you've got one tower and you've got a Yagi at the top of that one tower, you're going to see different terrain shapes at different azimuths. For example, my dear friend Jack, W1WEF, W1 Workum Fast, has in the direction towards Japan from Connecticut, he's got a terrain which drops off and continues to drop off. This is very good terrain towards Japan. His second best terrain is excellent terrain towards 45 degrees, in other words, towards Europe. The red one is towards ZS, towards South Africa, and it's now beginning to have a hump-like shape that the antenna is going to have a tough time looking over. And his worst direction is towards 140 degrees into deep South America. Now, what happens into deep South America, 140 degrees, the green one right here, that's his response. I didn't have, since I was showing azimuths towards Europe, South Africa, South America, and Japan, I didn't have an additional line to show a flatland response as a reference. But you can see how South America suffers a little bit compared to South Africa, compared to Europe, compared to the best shot into Japan. So for a single tower, you choose the optimal height for your most important direction, and for a W1, for a guy in New England, it would most likely be Europe, where most of the QSOs are made in a contest. Okay, some miscellaneous observations. Last November, I was privileged to go to the Asia-Pacific DX convention in Osaka, Japan, and I met a lot of old friends from Japan. I had 20 or 25 years ago, I had worked for a company that had a U.S. headquarters was in San Francisco, but the main office was in Nishinomiya, Japan. And several of the people that I met at the Asia-Pacific DX convention in November, which I highly recommend to people. It's intimate. It's a relatively small convention, but it's got some really savvy people, and they're a lot of fun. One day we went out to take a look at JA3AOP's QTH, and I realized that I had worked with Aki about 25 years ago, and neither he nor I knew the other one was a ham at the time. But we made up for that in a short visit to his magnificent QTH. When we were there in the afternoon, there was a long path opening to West Africa, Midwest Africa, to TR8. I want to show you what Aki's long path to Africa looks like. It is absolutely magnificent. It's about 300 feet high, about 100 meters high. Let me make sure about that. Yeah, about 400 feet high. Now, the long path, that was his long path. His short path to TR8 was this one right here, with a considerable hill in the way. And this is the response on 10 meters. The oscillations are due to the diffraction points, but he's got a tremendous amount of gain in long path, whereas into long path rather short path into TR8, he's got quite a deficit because of the hill in that direction. And in fact, every signal that he'd hear would be stronger on long path than it is on short path, and so it was actually difficult, even though he had a step IR type of antenna so that he could switch back and forth. It was difficult to make sense of what we were hearing because of the terrain in the two different directions. You might be interested. He lives on the top of that monstrous hill, and I asked him, what was all this stuff under the house that I could see? And he says, oh, that's hurricane strap. He literally straps the house down so that it doesn't go blowing away when the winds get real tough there on the top of his hill. This is an anomaly that you will see using HFTA very often if you are on low frequencies, like 80 meters, with a low height of antenna, let's say a 35-foot high antenna, and a steep upslope. This is KY6R's direction towards New Zealand. As an example, it says that the gain on a 30-foot antenna is higher than the gain on a 100-foot antenna on 80 meters, and that does not wash. It is not possible. And what is happening is that this is a diffraction aliasing spike in the program. So be careful at low frequencies and at low heights. If you go above the height at 100 feet, you can see that it shoots over this little hump over here. But it would have diffraction points here, here, all along here, 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 here. And those diffraction points add up to some very significant spikes, so be careful. This is my friend JA3 USA, Max Shimamoto. He lives in Nara, Japan. near Osaka, and you can see this is a Google Earth shot from I presume, a satellite showing his rather large antenna, which is a 100-foot crank-up tower, self-supporting crank-up tower. Now, this is his terrain towards the USA, and there's a drop-off in the first 100 feet or so. I'm about 20 feet. That sets the gain at the lower angles, and since it can peek over these diffraction points, you can see. You probably can't see this one because it's blocked by this one, but it can likely see this one. You can likely see this one, this one. There are many different diffraction points possible. And when that happens, you get a very complicated looking curve. But what it's saying is that because of the slope early on, he's got good low frequency response, but the response over the other side, beyond the base of the tower, is not entirely intuitive. It's not intuitive because of all those complex diffractions going on. So let me put this all together and tie up a bow on it and say, in order to launch a signal into the ionosphere, an optimal level of signal, you need to know the range of elevation angles for full coverage to your target destination, whether that is all of the continent of Europe, whether it is into Japan, or throughout the U.S., or wherever your target is. You've got to know the range of angles necessary to get there. You need to know how your antennas work under ideal conditions, that is, if they're placed in free space or if they're over flat ground. Then you need to take into account the irregular local terrain, and you can optimize heights, stacks, or tower placement on your property. And let me try to steer you away from going too crazy about this stuff, because you've got to keep your perspective. It is very easy to get very involved, even consumed in antenna modeling and terrain analysis. The tendency is to shoot for the less 0.01 dB of gain. Let me point out that if you're already S9 plus 20 dB into Europe, bulldozing your terrain may get you another 2 dB of gain, and that would result in an S9 plus 22 dB signal compared to your efforts before, where you only had an S9 plus 20 dB signal. Now, bear in mind that in a pileup, or if you're at the very under poor propagation conditions and your signal is right at the noise level, 2 dB can be a big deal. I believe very strongly that you open up layers of DX with about every 2 dB of extra gain, you open up another layer of DX. But you're going to get your bulldozer ready to do that? That's the question. Ken, that's the end of the show.
Okay, very good. I don't know anyone that would take it to that extreme. I'm sure you've never run into anyone either, have you?
Yes, I have.
But we won't name names, especially because we're
right.
recording this event too. Okay, great, Dean. Okay, so it's question and answer time. If you would like to send in a question on your little webinar application, there's a questions box. So you may have to hit the plus sign to the left of the questions to expand it. But anyways, put your question in there. If you would, add your call sign and then hit send, and we'll go ahead and pick that up. If you happen to have a microphone connected to your PC, to your sound card, and you'd like to try to speak to us directly, we can go ahead and maybe take 1 or 2 of those. Everyone is muted, so what you need to do is on the far left of your control panel there for the webinar, there's a little, they call it a grab tab, but anyways, there's a hand. I think it's a yellow hand, and if you go ahead and click on that, that's the same thing as raising your hand in the classroom, and what I can do is go ahead and pick you up and unmute you, and we'll try that. So if you've got any questions, go ahead and fire those in now. We'll pick those up. Dean, it may be worth mentioning, I was thinking as we were going along here, you did a webinar sometime back, a couple of years ago, on generating the terrain profiles using the microdem. And if anyone is interested in that, it is on the PVRC website at www.pvrc.org. and there's a webinar link, and I think, archived webinars, so you should find it under there. And I think maybe that program has changed a little bit, but for the most part, I believe it all stays the same. So that may be worth checking into as well.
Yeah, there's another site, the NCCC.cc has got webinars as well, dealing with the same subject and other ones besides.
Okay, so we've got a couple questions lined up here. Let's go ahead and grab those. The first one does come from Ash in Tunisia, 3 Victor 8 Bravo Bravo, KF 5 Echo Yankee Yankee. And I think this is pretty much in line with your last point. And his question is, how much can we really rely on HFTA findings to make changes to the station configuration?
Well, I've done hundreds of evaluations and gotten a lot of feedback from people, Ash. Well, you're gonna give me some feedback too when you change the 3 Victor 8 Bravo Bravo station, I'm sure. But there's been a lot of good feedback correlating the HFTA assessment and actual on the air results.
Okay, next from Jim, K7 Whiskey Alpha. Do takeoff angles vary for domestic contests, West Coast to East Coast? And I think you actually did another webinar with some of that information.
Oh, that's right. There was another PVRC webinar talking about what's your delight here, domestic or DX, I think it was.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
What is your preference? And it turns out that if you closely study the angles involved, let's say from Washington D.C. to Boston, well, those angles are going to be up there about 35 degrees. They're high angles. But the angles towards Washington D.C. to Dallas, which is just about the center of the USA, are actually lower than the angles necessary from Washington D.C. to Seattle. Typically, the angles to Dallas would be 10 to 15 degrees, and 5 to 10 degrees, excuse me, whereas the angles from Washington, D.C. to Seattle are more like 15 degrees. And what is happening is that you're covering both a single F2 hop and you're covering 2 F2 hops. And the single F2 hop is a very low angle. So consequently, working into Dallas, you'll find that the signals are actually stronger from Washington, D.C. On the higher antennas than they are on the lower antennas, given flat ground reference. So it turns out that the same antennas that you use for DX contests will actually work very well for domestic contests as well, especially if you use them in stacks.
Okay, Scott, K0MD. Dean, thanks for creating this great software program. It's a great tool for HF planning, and I could not agree more. It's fantastic. And Scott, thanks for joining us. We'll hook up later on and discuss the merits of the draft picks here in the NFL, the Green Bay Packers versus the Minnesota Vikings. We won't do that now.
Hey, what about the 49ers?
Yeah, that's right. No, let's not get started with that, too. Okay, next from Fred, K9VV stroke KP2, I guess NP2X. Are the PRO files the same for short path versus long path? It seems to me they'd be different. Comments, please.
The actual computed statistical files are for short path, but I think the angles are usually a little bit lower for long path. But I see, Fred, that you've got your concrete in the ground now and you're ready to go, huh?
Yep, looks like it. So, okay, Eric, K9 Echo Sugar, just wanted to mention in Florida they use the BOP, both out of phase for 2015 and 10-meter shots to the Caribbean, to be heard over stations 500 miles to the north of us. So there is someone that did find some use for the both out of phase option that you mentioned.
Yeah, you're the exception that proves the rule.
All right, Steve, November Yankee 3 Alpha, the alias slide with the 30-foot versus the 100-foot 80 antenna. Is the low antenna gain peak for real? In other words, is it possible to have a low angle gain peak with a low antenna going over a saddleback or uphill?
I don't think it's real. That's why I warned you against it.
Okay. Um,
Let me expand on that.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead. Absolutely.
HFTA or a ray tracing program using diffractions is basically a high frequency asymptotic kind of program. In other words, the sizes of the plates that you're considering when you're shooting at various pieces of terrain become larger at the lower frequencies, and so the accuracy of ray tracing is using HFTA is better on the higher frequencies. That's why I warn people: don't believe impossible situations on 80 meters with low antennas. It's just not there.
Okay, Bill, VE4 Kilo Zulu, and this may go partially to what we were discussing with your earlier webinar in the microdam program, but he says, I've hand plotted the terrain from maps. I take an elevation every 500 meters out to about 4,000 meters. Am I in the ballpark for resolution and useful results?
You're in the ballpark. I think there is a site, by the way, that Canadian digital electronic maps are available. You do a Google search on digital elevation maps Canada and see if you can find them. You can also use the SRTM, the shuttle radar topography mission program that were taken by the space shuttle and converted into readable data. You do that for just about all of the world, with the exception of the very high northern lands where the shuttle didn't go, and the very high or low high elevation angles in terms of south latitude in the southern hemisphere. But for all of Canada, the SRTM information is there, although it is 90-meter spacings instead of 30-meter spacings that are available in the U.S. Okay,
we've got just a couple more questions, so let's go ahead and we'll knock these out here. Ezekiel asked, HFTA statistics, do they include 50 megahertz, or do you cut off at like 30? What's the cutoff point?
The cutoff point is 30 megahertz. The VOA cap or its predecessor, the ION cap program, do not accurately do 6 meters. There was no. They were designed for broadcast stations like Kenworth's on, with monstrous antennas and arrays, and they didn't go typically above about 25 megahertz, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Joe K3RR is wondering, do Fresnel zone reflection areas relate to HFTA reflection points?
Yes, they do. They do. It's part of the same mathematics that's going on for reflections.
Okay, John, W2 India Delta. The software sometimes shows really terrific figures of merit with crazy stacking distances like 20-meter beams 5 feet apart. What is a recommended approach to find out if the results you are seeing are achievable in the real world?
A good question, and it's actually answered in the instruction manual for HFTA. I warn people, do not use spacings on stacks of less than about half a wavelength. For example, on 20 meters, if you stack them closer than about 30 feet, you're going to run into problems because the internal mathematical model for the antennas is very simple. It's a isotropic antenna with gain, if you will, and so it does not take into account any of the interactions between closely spaced antennas. So don't fool yourself. Keep it greater than at least a half wavelength apart.
Okay, let's go ahead and wrap it up with this comment from Andreas. He says, thanks, Dean. Your program saved me a lot of money as I realized that a 55-foot crank-up tower is more than enough as I got 10-degree slopes in the main angles of interest. So another person that has benefited from your years and years of work on this stuff. So with that, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Dean, you have anything else you want to add before we close things down?
No, I think I've talked myself out.
Okay, very good. Well, once again, thanks a bunch for all you've done for us, and for being here for the presentation this evening. And I'm sure it'll get plenty of views. This has been recorded, that we will put it up on the WWROF webpage, and that should be up in the next couple of days. We'll send out an announcement. And I'm working on some future webinars, nothing to add to that at the moment, but we do have some things in the works. And of course, I'd always love to hear from you if you have some suggestions on topics or people to do presentations. Always looking for some topics of interest and some interesting people to present things. So, Dean, again, thanks. Take care. Everyone else, thank you for joining us. Pass the word if you would. Got a great program going here, and we always have plenty of seats available. We actually, this subscription allows us up to 1,000 people, which we are obviously not going to hit, but we have plenty of room to accommodate anyone that wants to join us. So, take care, everyone. Thank you much for joining us, and we will see you next time. So long. Bye-bye.